Hey, it's Scott. So I just kind of wanted to elaborate a little bit on what I meant when I was talking about big art, which is like specifically the phrasing that I used was big art propaganda, which I love because it's such an absurd thing to say. Like, first of all, what is big art? I've never heard of big art. And what is big art propaganda? Because it sounds ridiculous. Um, and naturally it's like, well, what is big art, right? And it's like a lot of things, you put big in front of it and you turn something that's an institution or a known concept into like an abstract entity with a will of its own. So you hear people talk about big X and it's like, all right, you got big pharma, big government, big art, big chungus. It's this abstract thing that goes over the individual, um, like the individual components of that thing, and guides it in a general direction. Um, so what I had said specifically was that the big art propaganda is that the way to get better at art is to practice or to do, well, not even just to practice, right? It's to do X. And much like education, right? We tend to teach people that you have to do X to get result Y. And it's a good way, to teach generally, right? So like, the if somebody wants to draw like people, one of the first things they'll do is they'll search like, oh yeah, how do I draw like a face, or like how do I draw an eye, and then you'll get a tutorial, and the tutorial will be like, all right, first you start with a circle, and then you section off the circle with eyelids, and then you delete the outer bits of those eyelids, and then you have an inner circle for the pupil and the iris, maybe some lines to illustrate, like, I don't know the word of it off the top of my head, but you know that little, the skin between like your brow and your like actual eyelash line right there. So you start with the circle. You're working from basic shapes, and you are constructing your eye from 2D shapes so that it is rendered in 2D, and it looks like an eye in 2D, right? So this is like the big art approach as to like, how do I draw an eye? Well, big art comes to you and they say, the drawing an eye, easy peasy. This is what you do. However, what they don't say is that, well, actually, before I get to that point, right? Just like another example, like how do I draw a face? And this is like the most common one. Well, what do you need to do? You start from a circle, right? Start from a circle, and then you divide that circle into two equal halves, and then you add a line for the jaw on both sides, and then through the center of this shape you draw a line, then you draw another line halfway between those, then another line halfway between those, and then you get, okay, I've constructed the 2D image of a drawing of a face, right? And then it goes further into like, how do you draw an eye? Well, you draw a circle, you put in the like constraints for the that circle, to make them eye shaped, some eyelashes, etc., etc. Then your nose goes down to where the second line is, and then your mouth goes down where the third line is, right? And it's a little messy because I've drawn these with a pen, but we delete all the guidelines, and maybe not the most pleasant face, right? But vector lines, man. How do they work? But a face nonetheless. And you've done it. You've accomplished the mission that Big Art set out to instruct you how to do. Right? You have drawn the face. This teaches you, and is a common way people learn, like how to draw a face. And it works, right? For the basics, for getting started, it works, and you end up with a product that's honestly not bad. Like, you can show it to somebody, and you can be like, "Oh, hey, I've drawn a human head," and it's like, dude, sick, radical. You're the best manga artist I've ever seen. Um, However, even though it's efficient at teaching a person how to draw X thing, it does not teach them the underlying principles that got to that simplified place, right? So, like, sure, you can now draw that anime head or that cartoon head, or you can draw that mountain range, right? But what is it actually that you're drawing? Because learning this way is teaching you how to draw something that is 2D. Whereas learning the form of a thing is teaching you how to draw something that exists. And then the manipulation of those existing forms is what adds style to a thing, right? So, like, instead of saying, oh, you draw the eye by making a circle and then subdividing it, what you're really doing when you draw an eye, right, is you are drawing a sphere, right? But you can't tell that it's a sphere because it's on a two-dimensional plane. But if you were to subdivide it, right, you have all of these contour lines. And what you have is a three-dimensional object. And when you say, all right, put something over the eye to make the eyelids, it's not a line. We're putting items of thickness over a three-dimensional sphere, right? So it's not just a single line. It is a plane, right? So it is a plane with thickness that we are slapping over the eye. Up my eraser size here. And because it's going over the eye, that's what gives it its rounded shape. Because if there were no eye there, it would just be flat. It would just be a straight line because it is a plane that needs to interact with something. And if you know this about the construction of an eye, you can then draw mini eyes, right? You no longer need a tutorial that says this is specifically how you draw an eye, because you know what the eye is, right? And this is my gripe with a lot of tutorials, a lot of what I like to call the big art propaganda, is that they tell you how to do something, but they don't explain necessarily why it is what you're doing looks the way that it looks. Um, and it's really that's the gist of what I think about when I think about tutorials that I see online, is that people are looking at tutorials on how to do 2D things, but not tutorials on how to draw and manipulate things that exist in such a way that they become original creations. Um, and that's not to say that these things don't help, right? Um, because I think most people will find them useful, and I think that especially children, they look at the creation of these kinds of things and they go, okay, that's easy to understand. There's not a lot that I have to think about, right? But if you have like a face, right, and you've done it in this way where you've drawn your guidelines and you put the things in the places you were told that they belong, well, then when you try to manipulate that face, it becomes weird because your guidelines are messed up because you don't know what the guidelines are based off of. It's kind of like in algebraic proof, right? So, like, you have your circle that you started with before, and you want to make this same face, but you want to make them looking down, you have the idea that you should draw that center line, and then you draw the line for your guide, for the jaw, and then what do you do, right? You were taught that the proportions of the face means that you draw a line through the center, another line, another line. You get your eyes in there, your nose, your mouth. Then you just have him looking down. And it's fine, right? He's looking down. However, much more effective is you know that you have drawn a sphere with structures put on it for like the chin, right? Because it's not lines. My primary gripe is you are never really drawing with lines. Your lines are just there to help you determine the form of an object, right? So this circle that we use to start with is a guide, right? It is here, much like the eyeball bit, to symbolize a sphere. And this sphere is to symbolize in a simplified form the shape of the skull, right? Because, in an actual skull, you have these divots for the temple, then you have this bit for cheekbones, and then it comes down, and then you have like the top of the mouth, right? And then your nasal cavity. And then this actually comes down like this. And the front of the head is actually a little bit smaller than like the back of the head. So it's definitely not a perfect circle. But when you're drawing something and you're teaching somebody to draw lines, it's easier to say, just use the circle. And then you have a couple of additional forms that come down. And these forms make up the lower jaw. And you have divots here for like the eyes, except they're more circular. You have your bones of the face that come down. And if you were to just like feel your own face, you would be able to feel out a lot of these structures yourself. And it's a lot more useful to know what the form of something is rather than how to draw something is the crux of what I'm getting at. And it's my honest belief that knowing the form of something will enable you to become a much better drawer. Not necessarily a much better artist, because I have the belief that those are two completely separate things, right? But yeah, big art doesn't want you to know this one simple trick, and it's that you should understand what it is that you're drawing. And they won't tell you it because they want you to keep purchasing how to draw books. No, that's a joke. The crux of it for me, to repeat myself for the billionth time, is that forms are important, but they are often glossed over when people are either seeking out information on how to draw, or when people are instructing other people on how to draw. And there's a critical thinking angle to it as well, because a lot of the times we'll say, if you can't draw something, look up a reference and figure out what's going on. Well, without any guidance, you say, look at the reference. And it's like, okay, I will copy what I see in the reference, or I will copy the reference. But the point of getting the reference isn't to copy the reference. The point of getting the reference is to say, okay, I can see this reference, I can look around this reference, and I can determine based on this reference where the forms are. And using my amazing human ability to see an image, I can then work on those forms and incorporate my newfound understanding of those forms into the piece of art that I'm making. Because that, in no sense, that's the essence of drawing, right? Because if you are just copying what you see in reality, well, then you're Maybe you're a drawer, but you're certainly no artist. I would just consider you a printer. And it's a technical, like from a technical level, it's amazing to be able to reproduce something at high quality. But in terms of making great things or making interesting things, the ability to understand the form of something is crucial in conveying to other people what something is. So that said, there are lines that a lot of people learn when they are learning to draw. And then there are forms that people learn. And you can make a drawing by either combining lines together to make something, or by combining forms together to make something. And it is in the understanding of reality and the world of forms, which is the world that we live in, that you can make something that is not realistic, right? But believable. Because we don't live in a world of lines. So if you base a lot of your understanding of drawing on lines, well then I have to imagine that you're handicapping yourself to some degree. Anyways, that's all I got. I just wanted to elaborate a little bit. Until next time, ciao.